On behalf of CAI and the great IT professional, we would like to welcome everyone today to this panel discussion on managing projects in a post-pandemic world. My name is Michael Malutis, and I will be your disembodied moderator for today's event. I apologize that you're not able to see me visually, but I am here through the audio connection. Let's start out with a opening question, big question, to get things started. I'll toss this to Laura to get started. Laura, how would you say project management has been shifting and responding to the pandemic? Specifically, how did project management, in your experience, initially adjust in the early days of COVID, and how is it responding now?
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. I'm really excited to do this session today, and I'm just going to dive right in because I know we have tons to cover here. So, back in the beginning, early 2020, when the pandemic started becoming a very real worldwide massive shift for all of us in the project management and the PMO space, I started hearing a lot from the community. Well, what do I do now? And how do I keep the same things going that I've always been doing when everything around me is chaos? And how do I manage in this chaos? And I started doing a bunch of live Q&A sessions and talking to people in the community, and many of them were panicked, saying, okay, now what? How do I keep everything I've been doing on my projects, in my PMO, all my continuous improvement activities? How do I keep doing those? And my answer was, you don't. You don't keep doing the same old thing that got you to where you were, because all of a sudden the entire world was having to make a huge pivot and shift and respond very quickly. So what many business leaders found very fast is that those that were willing to pivot with them, those project managers, PMO leaders that were willing to make the pivot, quickly earned their seat at the table in the conversations that really needed to happen. Like, what happens if we have to cut our budget? What happens if we have to all go remote all of a sudden? What happens if we have to move people from this project to this project? What if we have to speed something up because COVID's created an opportunity, maybe for digital transformation, for example? And those PMO and project leaders that really understood that you don't just keep doing the same thing over and over again, you have to be able to be agile and shift and pivot and adapt to where your business needs you to go. Those project managers and PMO leaders were thriving. And so, this is something we've been talking about, all of us on this panel have been talking about for a long time. The future is now. And we got a really good chance to see that at the beginning of this pandemic, where those that knew that their role was changing and that they needed to be able to provide just-in-time information and pivot quickly when the needs of the organization shifted, those PMO and project leaders are continuing to thrive now where we are, almost getting close to 2 years into this whole thing. So I think it's shifted pretty significantly, but all in the ways that we all knew it was going to, and all in the ways that we knew that those that were successful, really successful pre-pandemic, continued to be successful during the pandemic, because they knew they were there to solve business problems, not project problems, and that made all the difference.
Susan, what are your thoughts on that same question? How did you see project management initially adjusting, and how do you see it responding now?
Well, first of all, well said, Laura. You brought up some points that I know about that I worked on myself. I actually, one of the articles I put out first was called Pivoting to Agile. So it's funny because before this, prepping for this panel discussion, I'd never talked to Laura about that, and we both had the same idea that that being able to pivot is really important. What it comes down to me is where the opportunities, talking to your clients, where their needs, that's where your opportunities are. And I think if you're always looking at those, for some people, this actually, I don't know if you want to call it winter or, sort of downtime, bad time, has actually been a really good time for a lot of businesses. And I've seen that, like, in proof of what Laura's saying, that those people who looked and said, okay, something's changed, a lot has changed. Now, where's the opportunity? Where's the need? One of the first, I follow Simon Sinek on LinkedIn, and one of the first things I saw from him was it was an audio of him speaking to his staff. I guess it went public, and he basically said, we got to shift. And if you don't shift, what is the future like? He goes, I don't know, but you're not here. And he's literally like being very glib with his staff about it. And it's true for all of us. And as a person who owns their own business, I was very aware. I lost many thousands of dollars of opportunities. There were 3 or 4 opportunities that fell through in March, and they were for the May timeframe. By time I got to May, those were replaced with other opportunities, and then have just been growing since then. And that was back in 2020. And so it was like, don't cry over the spilled milk. What's up now? What do things look like now? And honestly, people, organizations, like, as individuals working for a company, you should always be looking at what's a new opportunity. Look at that again. I know we come to the end of the year and a lot of people tend to look back on things, but really we should be doing that quarterly. That's kind of my take. And then the other thing that I noticed, I have a lot of colleagues who own small businesses, and there were some people who got very negative. And when you get negative about the situation, you find it harder to look for opportunity. So instead, I shifted myself and my students, because as you noted, Michael, I teach at universities. I shifted them to be grateful, to look for gratitude in things, look for gratitude in situations and people. It changes your frame of reference. And I think when you're grateful, you see opportunity. So a lot of it is inside yourself. Even in the worst situation, you can take a step back and say, okay, what am I grateful for? And where are there opportunities? And the people who I saw that did that have been very successful through this. And the people that I saw that were looking at negative things, when is this going to be over? When is it going to be back to the way it used to be? It's not going back. Like, we never go back. We only go forward. Somebody once said, if you're driving in a car, if you're spending more time looking in the rearview mirror than through the front dash, it's a recipe for disaster. And the same is true in our lives. So that's my take.
Great. Don, I'm going to give you the honors of closing this opening question, which is, how did you see project management initially adjusting in the early days of COVID, and how do you see it responding now?
Great. Well, thank you, Michael. I want to thank everyone who's online. I know this is a tough time of the year for everybody with Thanksgiving coming up this week, and appreciate everybody taking the time to sit in on this webinar. I think it's a very interesting subject. Let me just go back and give you just a little background so you understand where I'm coming from. We're an ISO 9001 2015 certified company with our quality management system that focuses strictly on, or very heavily on, risk. And so when COVID hit, we had teams literally all over the world. We do the software engineering for offshore oil and gas assets, and these drill ships and large assets are each one's worth about $1 billion. And our team goes on board and we make sure the software is all okay. So we're always traveling. When the first lockdowns occurred, I had teams in Norway, Azerbaijan, the Canary Islands, China, Brazil, and the North Sea. And what we found, and our teams are usually 2 to 5 people, and what we have with our engineers, everybody's trained to be a project manager, and we provide the tools for them also, because what we found was that although we understood what was going to happen, because in 2018, 2019, we had to respond to Ebola, and we understood what the issues were with the pandemic. And we were working in sub-Saharan Africa at that time, offshore, and working with our clients. We had to make sure we went through all those processes. Well, COVID hit, where people there was no idea as to how to get the test cases, get testing, get everything else, and countries were completely in disarray. One of our teams was stuck on a 28-day rotation in the North Sea, and because a number of European countries shut down, they spent 3 months on that rig. What happened was that was some of the most productive time they ever had on the rig, because they were cut off from everything else. And what we found was that our clients and our customers and customer representatives were not trained as project managers, and many times misunderstood what they needed to do. So it ended up being our teams and our team leads really took over the major projects for our clients. And what we found was that the only thing that slowed us down was were the restrictions on travel, but it didn't slow us down in the amount of work we did or the amount we do with our clients. We found is we're now coming out of COVID, and we see that we're going to be coming out of it slower than others because of the fact that we do a lot of work in, again, Africa, South and Central America, that those countries are not as far along as the first world countries are. So we're going to be seeing COVID in those countries for at least another 12 to 18 months. We don't see it changing there, but we see it changing now in Europe, in China, and Southeast Asia. So we see that getting back to normal, or what is going to be the new normal within the next 6 months. And I have to agree with Laura and Susan. We're not going back to the way things used to be. What we found, especially amongst our clients, is that our client representatives and our client project managers who were not effective have disappeared. We don't see them anymore. They're gone. So I think this has been an enormous opportunity for those of us who've been supporters of PMI, who've gotten that training, who've trained other people, and who focus, in our case, on project management with a big dose of risk, that's become very successful.
Don, I have a follow-up question based on something you just said. And after you respond to it, I'm curious what Laura and Susan have to think about it. But you mentioned that in China and Southeast Asia and in parts of Europe that you're currently seeing a return to normalcy, but then you qualified that as a return to a new normalcy. How would you, within the context of business and project management, how would you characterize this new normalcy? What makes this new normalcy different than the old way?
I think that what I see as the new normal is that our clients have become more aware of the risk and what happens when they don't address the risk as soon as possible. And for us, the new normal is the idea of pandemics and unknown unknowns for risks are going to have to be something they have to work through, and they must focus on that. There's no, I personally believe we will never see another project manager that's just a box checker. No one's going to go into a project with a check sheet and just check off the boxes. They're going to have to understand risk, and they're going to have to prove to their clients that they understand how to handle something that's going to completely come out of left field, and they won't know what to do with it. And they're going to have to figure out how to do that and how to explain to a client that they're going to keep them covered.
You know, it's interesting you talk about.
Heightened, just to summarize what Don said, basically heightened awareness of risk, heightened awareness of the costs of risk, and a sensitivity to this, to the unknowns of risk. I think that was kind of the net of what Don had said. Mm-hmm. Laura, you wanted to add to that?
Sure. I think that I love that you use the word box checking, Don, because I think that, and there's a lot that we're probably going to talk about today where we can go into that even more, but I think that was a big differentiator. Those that continued to try and put creating outputs and defining their value in terms of the outputs they created, instead of shifting their mindset and focusing on the outcomes that they could drive, those folks really suffered. Those that, we have to redefine in project management. And again, many of us have been saying this for a long time, but it takes a little while. It's like an overnight success is really a decade in the making, right? So when you finally cross that threshold of people getting it, something like a global pandemic will do just that. It will help people understand that you cannot continue to just check the boxes and define your value in the numbers of deliverables you create, the numbers of projects you manage, the number of people on your team, that's not where success is defined, and not even the budget that it takes to spend the money to get to the outcome. The outcome is what matters in the eyes of the business leaders. And so I'm so glad, Don, that you brought that whole box checking thing up, because that is the pivot we're talking about. Shifting from an outputs focus that is focused on what we planned to do versus the outcomes focus, which is what our business leaders are actually looking for us to drive. So I think that shift, that pivot, stop doing things the way we've always been doing them and start really transitioning to be thinking and acting like business leaders was the defining factor for what PMs and PMO leaders and the like were truly successful and continuing to be successful. So thanks for bringing that up, Don. Susan, I know you had something you wanted to say about this.
Yes. So it's tough because we can raise hands here, but Mike can see your hands. So Don, I want to key off of something else you said about risk management. So I've been a risk management SME for a number of years, and I've always been disappointed at the low attendance of people in my RMP, PMI certification classes, because it's, to me, risk management is how we juggle our uncertainty with scope, time, and cost for our projects. And so to me, if you're trying to be a successful PM, you need to be managing risk. And so it was interesting. A lot of people said, oh, who could have ever planned for this? How could you have had a plan for this? I'm like, well, actually, some of my federal clients had planned for it. I've worked at DOD. I've worked at Census Bureau. I'm actually now on a contract at FEMA. And actually, many of these agencies planned for it. Now, did they know that the pandemic would look like that? No. But they did plan for a major catastrophe of sorts that would have everybody have to be removed for a short period of time. Now, we didn't know that short period of time would be a long period of time. But the point is that there is a way to plan for unknown unknowns. The federal government, of course, has more resources, so they can plan for it. They also have a mission that's critical for that. So some things, even if a meteor hit DC, those agencies would continue to operate. So they know that, and so they go in planning for that. And so that's one thing that I see as being a good thing coming out of this, is that people realize that risk management is very real, and how it's going to impact your business versus the federal government's a little bit different. I know for myself individually, I try to keep in the bank a certain amount of money. Well, guess what? That amount of money I want to keep in the bank doubled after that, because I realized that what I thought, you could have like a month or two issue, well, it could be a 6 month or a year issue. And so it changed my frame of reference for contingency planning for myself, for my business, with my husband and our family. So that shifted that. So what that shift looks like is going to be different for every organization, every person. So that's one point. So I do hope that one lesson learned that everybody has is to really appreciate and respect risk management, not to be afraid of it, but to just plan for unknown things. You really can plan for unknown things. I will tell you, Census Bureau was already, had basically a whole, you could work remote, and they had put it in place based on some snowstorms and things like that. The only hiccup they had was bandwidth, because everybody was remote all at once. But beyond that, they had the tools, they had the technology, and the people I know that were over there, they were good to go in a short period of time. The other thing I saw at universities, I teach at 3 different universities, as Michael mentioned, and the one that was the smallest university had the easiest time transitioning. They also had a big online, their master's degree program is online. I've been teaching online for many years, so it was really no change to me. But the reality is it was a shift for me, because all of my students were going through this professionally and dealing with these changes. But I did notice that smaller organizations shifted quicker, and that has to do with agility and sort of, I guess physics laws of motion. Smaller things have less resistance than larger things, less friction when you're trying to change. And so I saw that. I actually would love to do an article one day about universities and their ability to adapt depending on the size of them. The other thing that I wanted to note off of what Don said was that we shifted from being co-located to virtual. And I used to teach ski instruction, and I don't know, how good people are at skiing, but if you can think of another sport or another skill you have, I'm on a medium slope. I look pretty good. I'm skiing along. I'm doing great. And then if I get onto an expert slope, I don't look as great. And it's the same skill set I have, but I'm doing it in a more difficult environment. So what I find when you teach and when you learn, because I've been to a lot of clinics, you want to work on your skills in that easier environment so that when you get to the harder environment, then you have the skills that you need in that environment. Well, I think of virtual as the expert slope for project managers, right? So we can go along on that medium slope being kind of okay, and our lack of ability to communicate effectively tends to work out because we're co-located. So we have a lot of sort of organic communications, and we can see people and we can check in with people easily. But if our communication skills are poor, or our team doesn't have a good trust basis and a good way of working together, when we go to that expert slope, meaning operating virtually with our team, things can break down real quick. And so I think it was interesting. I think Laura mentioned this, how, PMs that weren't, and Don mentioned it too, PMs that didn't do well were just gone, because you're basically not going to make it on the expert slope of operating virtually. And so if we can think of it that way, that it's all the skills that we would use when we're co-located, but we just got to be better at them when we're virtual. And when I've seen people do that, they've actually performed just as well. The great functioning team functioned great virtually. Should be no surprise. But if a team was functioning poorly and lacked communication in a co-located environment, they're just going to be destroyed. They're going to be the person on the expert slope with the skis flying and the gloves falling off and all those things. And so we don't want to be in that predicament as PMs, for sure. So we got to, it goes back to skills and fundamentals, I think.
Thank you, everybody. I have another follow-up question based on something that Laura said. She had talked about one of the things that came out of her response was the importance of thinking and acting like business leaders and focusing on outcomes and not about output. Just, Laura, for the benefit of our audience, I know that this is an entire presentation in itself, and so we want to kind of try to cap this a bit, but what would you say that the 3 or 4 most important things are that people need to be conscious of if they want to start thinking like business leaders and start focusing more on outcomes as opposed to output? What are the most important ways that you would characterize that in your experience?
Sure. Okay. So, and yes, I actually do have a whole framework around this. It's called becoming an impact driver. And of course, the IMPACT stands for something. So I'll pull a few of those out to make it simple. I is for instill focus. Part of the challenge that we have is that we create this focus on those deliverables, right? And we create this focus on doing the project work and defining our value in the project work, as opposed to really getting crystal clear about why we're doing what we're doing. And so understanding the why is the very first thing that we should be looking at when we're looking at what problems we're solving, the projects we're doing. Many times, and I totally get it, project managers, many times the project is thrown over the fence after the strategy's all been figured out and now you're at the point of execution. But it is your fiduciary responsibility. It is your business opportunity to look at why you're doing that work you're doing, and be sure that everybody that's on that project understands why they're doing the work that they're doing. If you want to create a community, a team of impact drivers, people that are focused on getting the results, driving outcomes, they got to understand why they're there. I read a really, really depressing statistic which said that 95% of workers in an organization don't understand that organization's business strategy. 95%. That is absolutely inexcusable if they have anyone in the project management space in that organization, because you are the ones that are driving the change, and you are the ones that need to say, why are we doing this? And I don't want to hear anything about, well, they're not telling us. Go ask the right questions, which is, and tell them that if you don't understand why, and if you don't understand the business outcomes that they're trying to be achieved, you can pretty much guarantee they won't happen. right? And when you put it in those terms, how can your business leader say no to that? It only takes 10, 15 minutes max. It's a few sentences. Why are we doing this? And what is the outcome we want to achieve? Then you are well positioned to be thinking and acting like a business leader along the whole process, right? Because now you're saying, okay, well, when our business, and here's a big problem that a lot of us have, and this gets into the measure outcome step, which is the M in this. One of the problems we have is that we define our value, we measure our success in terms of things like, Susan, plug your ears, you're not gonna be happy about this, in terms of earned value management, right? Well, what is the one thing that EVM actually doesn't measure? Value. Not in terms of what the business leaders are looking for. It'll tell you spent some money and you've taken some time, but it does not guarantee that you got the results that your business leaders are looking for. So instead of us saying, well, we got to protect that triple constraint with all of our heart and soul, the business leaders might be perfectly fine making a change if it's going to get them the outcome that they're looking for. So we have to stop making decisions that don't belong to us and start facilitating getting the right decisions and the right information in our business leaders' hands to achieve those outcomes. Because we're over here saying, sorry, no, you can't get in front of our control board for 3 months. And I know that the market shifted. I know COVID happened, but we can't change this project. We got to say enough with this can't, and just shift our whole mindset and our whole way of thinking to say, yes, and here's what it's going to take. And by doing those little things, and there's, Michael, as you know, there's a million more of those, but just by doing those initial things, we're changing the whole dialogue. And instead of being a barrier to progress, our business leaders see us driving the progress, right? And facilitating getting to the outcomes as quickly as possible so that we can achieve that highest possible return on investment. And I guarantee you, I don't want to hear any PM or PMO leader in particular say, we don't measure ROI, because I guarantee your executives do. Even I work with tons of nonprofits and associations and government organizations. Susan, you spend a lot of time with government. They ask, is it worth doing this, right? And that's really what return on investment is all about. So if you start saying, what's the worth it factor on this? Why are we doing this? How can we ensure that we get the best possible outcomes? And that might mean changing our outputs. Then you are going to, those are some really quick and easy things to do, frankly, that achieve such a phenomenal change in how the organization sees you, sees the function of project management, and sees you driving results for the organization. That's why my students get a seat at the table, because they're not thinking like project managers, they're thinking like business leaders. And that's my call to arms to all of you. If you want to be seen as an impact driver in your organization, you got to act like it.
Anybody have any follow-up to that? That's a big response. Thank you, Laura. Susan, Don, you have anything to add to that?
Don't get me started.
Definitely about value. I agree. I am a triple constraint fan, but at the end of the day, if we're not creating value for our customer, what are we actually doing? So to me, the scope, the reason why we look at scope and we want to continue to look at it, whether you're doing traditional or agile, you do want to be mindful of, is the scope that we're delivering adding value to the customer? I think that's the disconnect that actually Agile stepped in to resolve. And not only has it helped with that, but I think it's also helped us, even for traditional projects, to stop and think about, what am I doing? How does this add value to my customer? Because giving the customer what they asked for, but not what they needed, will never solve the problem. And so we always have to ask those questions. What value does this create? I'm also a big fan of starting with why.
Yeah.
Even in risk management, I think a lot of the reasons it's a checkbox activity is because people are doing the what, and they know maybe the how, but why. And if you don't know why risk management is important, think back the last 2 years. Okay, that's why it's important. And there's always that black swan, that event that you never thought would happen, but yet it happens. And what do you do? And we all deal with it in some way, shape, or form. But I always want to ask my customer, why are we doing this? What's important to you? Sometimes what's important to the customer is really not the way you're driving things and not the way you're doing work. I deal with that a lot in the contract arena. So, you may have a statement of work and you're working towards that statement of work, that statement of work could be a year old in the IT arena. And by the time it got through procurement and you showed up there, guess what? What's important to your customers now completely different. And we deal with that all the time. And how do I deliver to my customer while staying inside this statement of work? And that could be challenging because what they actually need right now is very different from what's statement of work. And you say, oh, okay, great, go ahead and change the statement of work. Well, if you think that, then you've probably never done a federal government contract because those things don't change real quickly. Okay. So instead, you got to get creative and figure out how to support your customer and still stay profitable because we're not there as a volunteer effort. Contractors are there to make money, but we also want to make sure our customers are happy. And if we don't, in the long run, we're not going to continue when that contract falls on or when there's additional work, et cetera. And so that's always a challenge in those contracts. But it comes down to what's important to them. Not what the statement of work says, not what the scope says, not what the requirements say, but what they actually need. And it reminds me, I don't know if people remember that visual with the swing, like what the customer asked for, what marketing sold them, right? I remember seeing that back, gosh, like over 2 decades ago when I started in engineering, and it made me chuckle. And there's several other versions of it, but honestly, to this day, it is still valid. You know, what people ask for and what they actually need are 2 totally different things. And it's our jobs as PMs to understand what they need, not just what they ask for. If we deliver what they ask for and not what they need, we're sure to fail. That is my take, because most people don't actually know what they need. They see something and they're like, oh, this will solve my problem. And that's our job. Our job as PMs is to solve the problem. We need to understand the value. We need to understand the need. So if we get back to those basics, we can help our customer be successful, because if they knew how to do it themselves, then we wouldn't be doing that work. So that's both internal and external customers.
I just want to say one thing on that, Susan, because you were spot on. And I think the challenge is that we expect our customers to know what they need, and they don't, but they do know why they need it. And that's what keeps going back to what you and I love with the whole Simon Sinek start with why and all of that, is that they do know the pain. They are not experts in project management. They are not experts in the solutions, but they are experts in their own pain. And so that's where we should stay focused. And so I think I just wanted to touch on that because that's such a good point. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that's one of the key things when you look at how to be successful. What we worked through many times, and before COVID, we had just opened an office in Russia, and we do work on Sakhalin Island, and getting to the sites on Sakhalin Island, it's anywhere from 36 to 48 hours from Houston, Texas, to get there. There's 5 sites there working for Exxon, and we have teams at each one of the sites. So not only do our team leaders, project managers have to coordinate amongst ourselves, they've got to coordinate with 5 disparate organizations within Exxon. And you're absolutely correct. They understand why they need what they need. An example was cybersecurity. We installed all the cybersecurity for those 5 sites. It was a year effort, and it took a lot of work with us working with the colleagues. What we found, and one thing I found over the decades and decades of doing this, is many times management, senior management, and PMOs overlook what I feel is the most critical aspect of project management, and that's the soft skills. Mm-hmm. How do you do a presentation? I've also seen the people who failed in our new environment couldn't use Zoom, couldn't use Teams, couldn't use WebEx. They couldn't get it, and they never took the time to watch 3 or 4 YouTube videos to show them how to do it. And they're gone now too. So box checkers and people who can't do virtual tools are all gone as project managers. And I think that virtual it's a soft skill. How do you work with people? How do you convince people? How do you talk to people so they listen to you? You know, and especially when you're going across multi-cultures, multi-companies, and multi-generations. It's a difficult task, but that's just yet another skill that's got to be in our project managers' quivers.
I just want to say
I
I
know that.
totally agree with that, because the challenge that a lot of people said, well, it's hard to go online, or it's hard for us to do our jobs now, or I can't, what it was a lot of PMs that were used to micromanaging everything and hovering over people's desks, and now they can't do it, right? But here's the thing, those that know how to lead people and build relationships and engage stakeholders had no problem transitioning to online. I run a fantastic group coaching program for PMO leaders around the world, most of whom I've never met in person. And on the odd occasion I get to meet one of them in person, it's like a family reunion. It's a total love fest, because we know how to build strong, trusting relationships. And if our PMs and our PMO leaders really treat them like people, give them respect, understand they're human, show them that they are valued, and lead them on the path of why they're there and why the work, connect them to the work that they're doing, and help them understand that they are providing huge value to the organization, and then ultimately bring them with you through the change process. Instead of doing change to them, do it with them. You will have people that will go to the moon and back for you. They will do whatever you need them to do, because you're creating loyalty, because you're valuing them. So I'm so glad you said that, Don, because it really touches on a really important point. I think we make excuses when change happens, and come on, we're supposed to be the people that drive change in organizations. We have no excuse for saying this is hard, this is different. Suck it up, Buttercup. This is the job, right? This is what we do. We create change. So we have to be responsible for bringing people with us through the change. And that means we have to adapt and pivot and rely not on being able to hover over somebody physically, but rely on our influencing skills and leadership and coaching and, relationship skills to get things done. That's the best way to get things done, with people and to people instead of through them. So thanks for bringing that up.
I want to pivot to, go ahead, Susan.
I've been a big proponent of virtual work for a long time. I've been off and on virtual for the last 2 decades, and I've seen benefits of being in the office, benefits of being online. And I know from where I live in between DC and New York areas, and I purposely live there. I'm a little bit off the beaten path, because also purposeful. It's relaxing to me in my type A personality and type A life. I live in a more serene environment, which is very nice. But so I've been a fan of virtual, but I've heard so many people say, oh, but we can never do that. We can never do that. I'm teaching a class right now, virtual project management, and somebody in the construction industry came up with how somebody in construction could actually do a majority of their work virtually, which is like mind blowing. But as a PM, it's not like you're nailing boards together,
Right.
You can do things virtually. And I'm not saying that we should replace everything with virtual. There is some value in seeing people. In fact, in July of this year, I went in to meet a bunch of people I work with. And ever since then, working with them has become way easier. But I also have good relationships with people. One of the people I work with she's in Florida. I have a great relationship with her. Never met her in person, but we chit chat about some things. I know a little bit about her life. Like you gotta kind of dig a little bit deeper. It's not just build relationships, like Laura said. And so I've been a huge proponent of it. And part of it is just because it's so limiting to say I can only work with people who live near me, or I have to drive to them. From a person who's traveled a great deal professionally, a great deal. I can name years where I didn't even like turn my stove on in my home. And I love to cook because I wasn't home. I was traveling all the time. And quite frankly, the idea of working virtually is wonderful. I train virtually, and everybody's, oh, virtual training isn't as good. Well, you're doing it wrong. Okay. So it's about engagement. It's how you engage with people. And the neat thing is I train companies who are global. Guess what? It's difficult for them to all get into the same place. It's expensive. It's prohibitive as far as like the time away from work. But I've taught classes to a bank that's across the whole, globe. And there's, the biggest challenge there is like who gets the short straw and has to be at class at 6 a.m. or 5 a.m. or at night, right? So that's the biggest challenge. but it's neat for them because these people work together and they actually get to do a training class together. So it becomes an opportunity for team building and an opportunity for trust building in the team. And so I'm a huge proponent of virtual, but if I ever have an opportunity to meet people in person, I want to do that. But there are people I work with in India and Mexico, and I may never actually meet them in my life. And we still have great relationships. So I think that's the thing, that if PMs, if I'd say one skill that they can put forward, it's not necessarily like technology of using Zoom. Like, yes, there is that. And as Don said, there's things that you can use to learn how to use this, but how do you build relationships virtually? That's the key. That's the challenge. And it isn't as easy. I have a client who's just all business, just like, do you have that report? When is that report? And it's so hard to be like, oh, Thanksgiving's coming. Are you doing something with your family? Like, I don't even know how many children he has. I know he has children, but he just doesn't want to talk about it. Some people are like that. And they're going to be more like that virtually than they are one-on-one, face-to-face. And so we got to figure out, how do we crack that open? How do we get to know that person a little bit better? Not in a negative way or intrusive way, but just to bring that out. And I think a lot of times people don't want to take that time virtually because they're like, well, we're in a meeting. Yeah, well then call a person. Sometimes I just call somebody one-on-one and chat with them. But that's where you build relationships, and it all comes down to relationships. And it doesn't matter if they're on the other side of a video Zoom, or they're on the phone, or they're standing right in front of you. It's all about relationships. So I wholeheartedly agree with that. And Michael, I know you had another thought here that I ran.
No, I just wanted to. I think it's a great discussion, and I don't want to. I don't want to be the one that stops the discussion. That's for sure. That's not my role here. But I did want to pivot to another question, which was, I'm wondering if each of you could kind of give us some real case studies, like examples of, and to some extent you've kind of touched on this on and off throughout the past 45 minutes, of how you had clients that had specific COVID-related challenges that either brought them down or that you were able to help them overcome, and how you did that. I'd like to start with Don. So can you give us an actual example of an actual client that had a COVID-related problem that you overcame in some way, either through a technology enablement or some type of hybrid project management or better communications or whatever it may be, or perhaps an example of something where they weren't able to rise to the occasion?
Thanks, Michael. I'm trying to sift through all the ones that with which we've had to deal over since COVID started. I think one of the critical ones in the Canary Islands in Las Palmas is where the majority of drill ships go to get refurbished and to have software reloads done and all kinds of minor maintenance done before they're then sent to places like Brazil or back up to the Caspian Sea or places like that. We usually work for the major, and in this case it was British Petroleum, and we had 3 teams in the Canary Islands, and working on 3 different vessels owned by 3 different drilling companies. So we've got the issues not only of working for our own client, but then having to help get the people who own the drill ships to work with us. COVID hits and the Spanish government shuts everything down. Not only did they shut everything down, but they then required that everybody get tests. And unfortunately, Canary Islands are off of the coast of North Africa. There are ways to get to, but the Spanish government said you can't do any work until you have everybody tested. And we couldn't get any tests in for almost close to a month. So what our lead there, the project manager, we spent a lot of time on the phone, and we got a hold of the U.S. Embassy and talked to the folks at the U.S. Embassy and explained to them what the situation was. And of course, they were in a state of disorder too. But all we did was ask them if they would talk to the Spanish government and not get the restriction eased, but allow it to be within a certain area of Las Palmas that included the hotels everybody was staying at and the shipyards. And with that, we got everything back and working again. The British Petroleum couldn't do it because the Spanish government is still irritated at Great Britain about Gibraltar. So they wouldn't even talk to the Brits about it. And the other companies were Norwegian companies, and we were the only American company that had a major stake in what was going on. And we could work with the American embassy. But it took our guys on the ground brainstorming what to do and basically put together all the information that the embassy needed so they could go to the Spanish government. And that was taken care of with that. But it was one of those issues where we had enough experience on the teams, and they dealt with some of these problems before. And we dealt with these problems with British Petroleum in Azerbaijan, in the Caspian Sea. And we'd also dealt with some of it with Russia when we'd done work in Russia. So our project managers were experienced enough to know that they couldn't do anything themselves, and they had to get a government involved. And luckily, the U.S. government was the most responsive and got on it right away and got it fixed. So that was one of the things that our project managers were able to do and our project teams were able to do. And it was it was difficult. It was really fraught with everything we looked at. When we looked at the risk, there was no way it was going to succeed because of all the craziness that was going on within our government and responding to COVID. But luckily, we found some reasonable people at the American Embassy in Spain.
Don, your stories are always so exotic. It's very hard to top them. But perhaps, Laura, you can give us a real case study of something that a client encountered that either brought them down or that you were able to overcome in some way.
Sure. Yeah. So as far as clients, everybody transitioned really smoothly. Everybody, because we already had the relationships built, and even new ones that were, kind of waiting, they kind of paused a little bit and then transitioned to online. I'd rather highlight a few of my students because I have these fabulous students that go through this PMO implementation program, and they're also in this coaching group. So I got to watch, I actually shut down my coaching group and wouldn't let anyone new in the program for 6-9 months because I was trying to make sure that I was available and ready to support my PMO coaching students that were in the middle of crisis, right? But some really cool things happened. And it was because they listened. They listened to me saying, listen, you've got to be business leaders, not project managers. You got to do these things. You got to listen to your business. You got to understand what the problems are. So, for example, one of my students, and she's actually on the podcast from 2020, one of my students had worked in one of the largest, community health centers it's in the Boston area. And they had to, of course, this is hospitals, right? They had to figure out how to respond to COVID. They had to figure out how to first the problem was, how do we keep people out of the hospital so that when people are coming in with COVID, we have the ability to respond to them and react and give them the proper care? How do we set up a COVID testing center? Not in 3 months that it would take us to normally set up our normal process for setting up a testing center. Let's do it in 3 days. And they did. What happened is the executive called the PMO leader and said, I have this business problem I need solved, and I need it done yesterday because we need to be able to do COVID testing like overnight. And so what she did was she didn't say, well, hold on, let me get my playbook out of how we normally do this, right? She said, all right, let's figure out how to streamline this process, do only the things that are critical to the success, and get this knocked out of the park. And so there's a podcast episode. I'll see if I can look it up and I'll put it in the chat. But it's part of the PMO Strategies podcast. Her name's Andrea. So you can look that up from 2020. She tells her whole story about how she did it. And the key was all the things that we're talking about here. So instead of it, taking months to get a COVID testing center up, they did it in 3 days. And then after things started settling down, now it was, well, how do we keep seeing patients without having to bring them into the hospital? So then the next business problem they needed to solve was that. So that's when they went to telehealth. And that's how they put virtual healthcare and virtual appointments and visits into place. super, super fast, and it was technology enabled, which is usually the hard part, right? But they knocked that out of the park as well. And then as things started to settle down, how do we get people back into the hospital when they need to be here, right? So pivot, 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 pivot. All along, they were having to shift and pivot. And not once did she say, sorry, that doesn't fit in our change control process. Sorry, we can't do that because we have these steps we need to follow. So the answer was always yes. And here's what it's going to take. So that's one example. I have another client who, was in a situation where they had to, and actually Eric Means is on the podcast as well a couple times, because when all this was happening, my PMO leaders were saying, how do I keep connected to my PMs? How do I take care of my people? So we talked a lot about the various things that you can do to take care of your people during that process. And so it's interesting to see that his reaction wasn't, sorry, we got to keep doing our continuous improvement things. He immediately transitioned to, how do I take care of my 100-person team of all these PMOs all across our organization, a large organization? How do I go to my people and take care of them so that they can continue to do the work that needs to be done for the organization? We had some other organizations that were big, and I can't say some names, but we have some other organizations like big global brand name, and they had to figure out how do they, that is very much brick and mortar presence. All of a sudden, everything's closed. How do they keep their revenues from just tanking? They had to pivot a lot to online. How did they make that pivot, right? They had to respond quickly and start looking at ways to really dominate the online space more than they had before, because every store was closed for extended periods of time. And the answer to all of these, in these cases, and same thing happened with my clients that called me and said, hey, I need you to do the thing. We're in an emergency here, right? It was always starting with, what is the business problem we're trying to solve, and how do we quickly identify the outcome? What's that most desired outcome? And then how do we shift our thinking, our focus, our resources, and all of the way we're doing the work we're doing so that we can achieve those outcomes? Another really interesting thing happened that had been resisted a lot, in addition to what Don and Susan were saying about shifting to online. And I mean, how many businesses told us, oh, we can't have remote. Nobody will get anything done. That's not the case when you have hard driving people. They're going to get the work done. In fact, they don't know when to shut it off, all of you type A's out there. So actually increased productivity. But another interesting thing that business leaders fight, that all of you PMs and PMO leaders need to really think about, and that is they created single task focus. They didn't try and do every single thing at once. Entire organizations would rally around their top priority. And the mere fact that they were creating prioritization around big business problems that need to get solved and allowed people to focus on solving them is why so many organizations were successful. They stopped trying to do same old, and they just got focused and got stuff done. So I think there's endless examples of that from my clients and students. Those are just a few. And it's all really just putting into practice what we were talking about here.
Amazing answers from both Don and Laura. Susan, I want to give you a chance as well to share some stories with us. Do you have anything that you could tell us about specific challenges that you saw with clients and how they either were overcome or not overcome?
Well, I also have a feel-good story that where they did overcome. It's actually the one that I wanted to share was what came up that actually resulted in me writing an article called Pivoting to Agile with a colleague of mine. So basically a student's colleague owned a physical therapy center, and they had just opened this center, and I think it was a joint effort. They opened with someone else, and they were like, oh my gosh, we have rent to pay and we have patients and we can't see them. What do we do? And so, again, this is a telehealth example, but this is a small business. This is not a hospital. And physical therapy is one of those things that people can say, oh, I guess I really don't need to do that. My husband goes to a chiropractor. My parents go to a chiropractor. They just kind of didn't go to their appointments for a while. So with this physical therapy center, they actively reached out to their customers and engaged them in telehealth, and were able to keep going and keep helping people and keep doing work with people. And that's really important too, because things like physical therapy, chiropractic, it may not seem something like dealing with cancer, but there are long-term health issues if somebody's regularly going to a physical therapist and then cannot, especially if they're healing from a surgery, something like that. I mean, there's a reason that you're required to go to physical therapy. It can have long-term health issues if you don't. And so they had to pivot and use telehealth. And they actually, at the same time, my colleague had actually suggested, so this actually, I say student and colleague, so they're a student of mine at one of my universities, and became a colleague of mine after taking class. And they were learning about Agile, and at the same time as I was teaching it to them, they were sharing it with their friend who had this business and trying to help them to transform to Agile. In fact, that was her final project, which was an Agile transformation plan for this physical therapy company organization. And it was very interesting to see how they were able to use Agile to bring telehealth to that business. And this is a small business that actually had some good results and was able to survive through things. And I think that there are a lot of small businesses that suffered. I think especially in the services industry, it became really difficult. But I heard a story of, I think it was, I want to say it was Texas Roadhouse, but I'm not exactly sure what the restaurant chain, but they decided to have like drive-in movies. So they showed free movies in the parking lot, and they brought food out to people in their parking lot in their cars. And it was like brilliant. Like, a lot of the restaurants where I live were only doing, carry out orders, like bring it to the curbside pickup. But to have a movie, like to actually like get a movie screen and throw that up there, and they're like, all right, everybody loves drive-in movies, right? And then why not get a burger while you're sitting there? So I think that's what it looks like when we talk about looking for opportunity. What is it that your customers need, and what are your skilled at in delivering to them, and focus on that. And I think that's where, even my own business, I lost a whole bunch of business, but I got other business by the end of that month. And I was like, well, was this just like the same business but virtual? It wasn't. It was actually different business, different customers, and it's somehow that gap filled. And I think that it was being optimistic and being opportunistic at the same time, and thinking about what's important to my customer and what can I deliver for them, and helping them through that. I was actually supposed to speak at a bunch of conferences, which became, boom, we're going to be virtual. And I actually, in some cases, I helped them with that shift to a virtual space. I also found myself helping a lot of colleagues of mine who were like, oh, I don't like virtual, I can't do that. And I actually gave them a lot of tips and tricks and things, because I had been teaching virtual for years. And one of the opportunities I did not take advantage of, so here's a negative thing, is that I've been teaching virtual for a really long time, and I probably should have put together a how to teach virtual video and put that together as a training opportunity and sold that. I didn't, because I was just so busy. Like, so literally that's why I missed that opportunity, because I didn't have the resources to be able to do it. It may still be valuable to do, but it's times like that you realize, wow, there's something I can do that other people can't do. And that's my value add. And then how do I match that with a customer that has a need? And if you can do that, it's a win-win. And that's what it looks like. That's how we do great things for our customers. Thank you, Mike. Good answer. Good question. Sorry.
Great answer.
Good. Great discussion. One of our best panels yet. Before I go on, and because we're at the 12 noon point, I want to ask Susan Soul if we have any questions in the queue from our attendees. Susan, is there anything in there waiting that we can maybe start getting to?
I don't see any right now, Michael, but if we remind everyone, if you do have questions, post them in the chat feature or the Q&A feature. And we'll also be showing all the panelists' emails, as Michael mentioned, at the end as well, if you'd like to reach out to them directly. I'm sure they would take your comments or questions via email. But I don't see any questions popping up right now.
Okay. That's okay. That's okay. I have a couple of bonus questions for the esteemed panel.
Bonus round.
We're in the bonus round. Okay, we're in the bonus round now. So, we hear a lot in the news about the supply chain crisis and what that means. And is there any connection? Do you see this impacting your jobs at all? Is it impacting your clients? Is it impacting your role as project managers? And how are you seeing this manifested, and how are you dealing with it?
So I'll go first if you don't mind, because we've got some, in many cases, some pretty horrendous supply chain issues across the world. But the one thing that the oil and gas companies were able to do, as opposed to the car companies, the oil and gas companies did not say stop producing, where the automobile companies said, we don't need those semiconductors right now, so we'll just wait a year and we'll tell you when to start up again. And that was an enormous mistake for the automotive company. The majority of the issues where we have with supply chain end up being from the suppliers. We have projects that are being held up because we can't get the equipment manufacturers, people in Norway, Germany, and in the US, they can't get the goods that they need. So what has happened, and the way that we've helped address that, is we've done surveys where we've looked for comparable equipment on rigs that aren't being used. And in essence, we put together a project to cannibalize rigs that are referred to as cold stacked, which means they're not going to be used. They have to be pretty much refurbished before they can be used again. And we ended up identifying where those products are. So it actually became another project for us to do, because we did have the data and the information on what equipment was on what rigs. So we basically became the directors of cannibalization of rigs, and the majority of those rigs are sitting in Scotland, which we're being in the process of dismantling, putting all that equipment in containers and having it shipped to places like Las Palmas.
Laura, Susan, do you have any experience with supply chain disruptions?
Susan, go ahead. I'll follow up after you.
Sure. Not directly have I experienced that, but to me, it more what's behind the supply chain is around global organizations. So I think that everybody's always thought, well, this is really great. We live in this global economy. We get to work with other people in other locations, and we get to do all these great things. We order something on Amazon. We don't really know where it's coming from. We just know it shows up at our door, right? So I think that this is something that is showing us how globally connected we are. I taught a class in April of 2020, just when everybody was locked down. I was supposed to teach it virtually anyway. And there were people, I had students online, and there was, I remember one person, every time they get on, you just hear all these little kids in the background, and there's nothing they could do about it. They lived in a small space and there's no separate room for them. And they were saying the biggest thing they missed was going to the gym, and they were saying they were getting their, the jug of milk or water out and using those for weights and things like that. And this was, I think the student was like in Madagascar, and it really didn't matter. Other than speaking a different language. Fortunately, they speak English, but I think they knew my class was in English. I only teach in English. I know a little bit of other languages, but not enough to teach. But we live in this global world. And so what that means is that, when the butterfly flaps its wings in Madagascar, there's like an impact to us. And it seems like novel and wonderful. And then the supply chain issue happens, and you're like, well, you get the good with the bad. And so what I see is that we're really well more interconnected than we give thought to on a regular basis. And I think the heads up for every organization is that realization. I actually, a few years ago, I did some course development work with a company in India. I never met the woman that I worked with, or the gentleman that I worked with on this project team. Never met them, probably never will meet them. However, worked on a whole project with them. I will tell you, when you get paid from another country, when that actually lands in your bank account, there's a lot of days in between. I will tell you that. But other than that, I mean, this is very real. And the impact. If I have a client in India and there's something economically going on that's negative in India, that's going to then affect my planned revenue for that year. And I'm a company of one. So that isn't supply chain as far as materials being delivered, but it is impactful as far as services are concerned. So I think that we all need to kind of take a step back and say, what does this really mean to my business? And if you're not an exec in your business, like Laura said, start to act like one, because you'll be a much more powerful project manager if you're acting like an executive, if you're thinking about how does this impact my business, and start communicating that up the chain. Because as PMs, we're kind of in the foxhole and we see things that our execs often don't see. And if we can start bringing that to attention, it's going to further your career. And in the end, I actually think there's an entrepreneur in pretty much all of us. And so when you're done working for some company, you're probably going to want to work for yourself. And those are the types of things that you need to do. So that's my take as an owner of a company of one, which is you can imagine any impacts are felt immediately for me and thoroughly, like not just professionally, but also in my household. So there's a lot more risk when you're a company of one. I mean, obviously you got to support people when you have a company of many people, but there's the resources don't run so deep. It's more about a network of partnerships with other people, and that's what's helped me out. But I have to be cognizant of the people I'm working with and what's going on for them. So that's how supply chain shows up for a service company of one.
So I'll just give a few bits of advice here on this, because it's really interesting that the pace and the desire for rapid change is actually continuing to increase. And, because now we're in a really interesting place as we go to this new normal, if you will, where people are like, okay, well, now we've got to get caught up on all the things that slowed us down or the ways we slowed down in response to this. So now we have this interesting dynamic where the desire for this rapid change is increasing, which means all of us as change managers need to be prepared for that. But at the same time, this supply chain issue means that the raw materials that many of us need to make these changes are actually slowing us down from being able to meet the commitments that our business leaders are asking us to meet. So I think it's really important that project managers and PMO leaders in particular that have the more holistic view of the whole strategy delivery process that are reliant on supply chain or any other of the many barriers to project delivery. I mean, supply chain is an example. It's an example of the kind of, oh, shoot, we didn't think about that. Right. And so as PMs, and I'm going to, tip my hat to Susan and Don here, who really focus on risk management. This means that we've got to get better about not just checking the box of doing risk management, but actually having really strong risk management practices so that we can evaluate the impacts of these kinds of barriers to being able to complete our projects on time and with the outcomes we're expecting. So we've got to plan for it properly and set expectations up front instead of just agreeing with these mostly arbitrary dates your business leaders are throwing out there to draw a line in the sand because they think if they don't, you'll just do nothing, right? So not saying that's true, but that is a lot of times. I'm telling you, I've had my seat at the table for a long time, and they're saying, well, let's just say it's going to be done at this time. And I always ask, I'm the same one in the room going, why exactly are you just going to draw this arbitrary line in the sand? Why don't we actually ask them what it's going to take to get it done and done right, and give those PMs an opportunity to actually set expectations realistically, considering the unknowns and the risks. And supply chain, again, is just one example. So this applies to you whether supply chain challenges are directly affecting you or not, because this is just an example of one of many ways where changes, unforeseen circumstances, I mean, come on, we've had our fair share over the last few years. We've got market shifts, we've got global economies that are changing, we've got political structures that are changing, everything is changing. That's the normal, right? Like we keep talking about this new normal. The normal is that change is going to be rapid and our business leaders are going to want everything yesterday. So by the time they give you the chance to fire that starting gun on that project, or setting up a PMO, for example, I guarantee you they have had enough and they are just exhausted and they just want to hurry up and get it done. So just remember, the day you start, you are already behind. I'm telling you, because by the time they got all the strategy figured out, by the time they got, the funding or they finally got sick of you telling them we need a PMO here and they finally said yes. By the time they do that, it's because the pain got so bad or the opportunity is so ripe and right in front of them that they need to act yesterday. So whatever it is that you're faced with, know whatever problem you're trying to solve, what business problem you're trying to solve, know that there are going to be challenges and you've got to be prepared by doing thoughtful planning, thoughtful risk management, asking why, challenging and pushing until you can figure out exactly what those outcomes are they're driving toward, and then setting realistic expectations. Even when they say, nope, that's too long, you can say, okay, we can change the timeline. That's a yes, right? Yes, not no. Yes, and here's what it will take, right? We know how to have a triple constraint conversation all day long. We've got to stop deciding or just blanket taking what they say as gospel. We have to start standing up for the project so that it can be successful, and do everyone a favor by being very realistic about what it's going to take and stop deciding ourselves and put the decisions back on our business leaders. So whatever it is, just make sure you're setting those expectations really clearly about what is achievable. And like Susan talks about in her book on hybrid project management, look at ways that you can be more adaptive and flexible and doing what makes sense as opposed to just following the checklist of a certain methodology.
Thank you, Laura.
Excellent.
If I can interject.
Go ahead. You can interject. Go ahead.
Great. So actually, for one of my clients, I'm leading a PMO, and they have these things that basically are fungible dates. Like somebody came up with this word. I don't know if you know what fungible date is, but you can guess that it's something a PM does not like. And it's funny because the client is like, yeah, so Susan doesn't really like that we don't stick to our dates. I'm like, no PM likes that. Like it's just funny. So at least now they're aware to the point that they can recognize, oh, that's not good. We should have a solid date. We should actually have that baseline, right? So at least I'm getting them into that space of awareness. But yes, we started on this project, and when we started, we were behind. Yeah, we were brought on board, and for 6 months before that, there was no one there. So they wanted us to accomplish in 3 months what hadn't been accomplished in 6 months, while we were trying to figure out how processes work. And we were already behind. The good news is we caught up and we did what we had to do, and we got it all done in time, and it's actually been quite miraculous. But the way that we did that actually was listening to what the customer needed, not what they were asking for. We often had to say no to the customer because they were trying to delegate and tell the staff what to do, rather than just saying, here's what we need, and then us figuring out how to make it happen. And I helped them by figuring out, so everything's priority one when you're that far behind. And so what I said is, okay, what is a must-have? What is a like to have? What is a should have? And what's not that important? Which there are very few things that were not that important. But being able to distinguish the must-haves allowed us to be agile on delivering the other things, because they wanted everything on time. And the reality is there were certain things that if the schedule slipped on those would be a major, major problem at the agency level. Okay. But there are other things, if the date slipped, it wouldn't be a big deal. And it's very difficult. It takes some trust building with the client to get them to a point where they can actually say, okay, this project can slip by a day. This one can't slip by any days. In fact, if you can get it done earlier, that'd be great. And so we had to build trust. And the way that we build trust is by delivering things on time. And then when the workload got heavier and heavier, we said, yeah, we can take that on, but we can't commit to being on date for everything. So tell us the things that really need to be on par. And I shifted that for them, and they actually, now they talk that way. They're like, okay, these are priority one things that they can't slip, and these are things that we want to get done. If they slip a day or two, that's fine as long as you communicate with us. And that in itself is a cultural shift, but that doesn't happen in an instant. It happens because you build trust. And you show people, you tell them, and then you show them the same thing, and there has to be consistency there. But it is difficult because there are a lot of fungible dates out there in the world, and PMs just have to deal with that. And if we can get them to appreciate why having a solid date and having solid milestones is critical for us to deliver value to them, it's really about education. So to me, consulting and training, somebody asked me the other day, which do you like more? I'm like, it's kind of all the same.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they kind of feed off of each other. They're really the same, because when I'm doing contract work, I'm training people. They just don't know I'm training them, but
Right.
that's what it looks like to be successful.
Right. Good consultants are teaching them how to fish so that they're able to stand on their own.
Yep, exactly.
You guys are the best. This is your real dream team when it comes to panel sessions. It's an absolute pleasure to moderate this. I do want to squeeze in one more bonus question. Just keep in mind that we're coming up against 12:30, so try to be quick. You may not have an answer to this. I mean, this is kind of a futuristic question, but I do. We all have read these statistics. IBM has said that within 2 to 3 years, 100% of all jobs will be impacted in some way, not quite sure how, but in some way by AI and machine learning. I was reading a study a quote I came across last night. I was reading an article, a paper that suggested that 75% to 80% of all service jobs are susceptible to being automated away using automation technologies. And of course, many of us are familiar with what's going on with robotic process automation, or what they call intelligent process automation, which is eating away at back office jobs that have been historically immune to various economic disruption and technological disruption. I'm wondering, do you see AI or machine learning or automation in any way impacting the project management profession over the next 5 years? Do you see your profession as being vulnerable to this in some way? Are you seeing any indications of this now? Or perhaps you don't have any particular thoughts about it? Open to anybody.
Oh, I'll kick off some of this with AI and machine learning, since I've been doing some of this for a number of years. I do not believe there's going to be a Siri for project management. I don't see Laura and Susan being crammed into a small box that's going to be on my desk so I can say, boy, I really hate these people I'm working for. They won't help me understand the risk. How do I do this, Laura, Susan? And then I get my answer back. Because it's just, we're on the bleeding, in project management, we're on the bleeding edge of dealing with human beings. And we're not going to automate that. I mean, there may be some aids. PMI may decide that they're going to put the PMBOK and everything else into a natural language format, so you can ask it questions and you'll come back with an answer. But that's just repetition. I don't see it impacting us in any way other than this becomes another tool that, again, I built these systems and built some of the first ones in the 80s when I was at Los Alamos Labs. To me, it's a tool that I try and steer people away from until they understand what it is they want to build. This is at the back end, when you start, just before you start coding is when you decide you're going to do something in AI. You don't decide it on the front end. Just my humble opinion.
Go ahead, Susan.
Oh, I'm shaking my head at that. I'd like to think that what I offer, what other PMs offer, is not something that is just speaking to Siri or speaking to Alexa and can easily be answered. I think that good PMs have a lot of a lot of intuition and know when to apply certain tools. And to me, it's an art. In fact, I did a presentation years ago, the art of risk management. I mean, there's an art to project management, and I think that there will be a lot of things that are replaced by AI, and I think that we will be involved with projects that entail that. But will PMs be replaced? I don't see that, unless what you're doing as a PM is so boilerplate that you probably are close to unemployment right now anyway. I mean, you've got to give people more value than that. But one thing I will say that I've seen, like just my local CVS, they now have a self-checkout, and I always use a self-checkout because I'm a techie person and I'm in a rush, and it's usually the shortest line. But half the times I use that self-checkout, something doesn't work right and somebody has to come over and help with it. And I know the people who own, because I'm in that CVS all the time, I know the people who manage it, and they're just like, it has been so frustrating to have that self-checkout. The one woman said, we lost a full-time person because we have that, and yet we end up helping people on it more often than not. And so it's like, so it comes down to people. And it comes down to, looking at your customer, what adds value for your customer. I go to one grocery store, has no self-checkout. I go to another grocery store that has a self-checkout. But the self-checkout at that grocery store has a person who's just in the self-checkout area to help anybody in the self-checkout area. Now, is one person and 6 registers there, so they've done a good job with that. But if you're going to have a self-checkout and not have a person designated to help with it, it's not going to work. And so how does that relate to other places? I think what it means is that we have to understand our customer, and AI it's not just going to solve everything miraculously. It's going to be able to, we're going to be able to notice the difference between a simple task and something that requires a lot more knowledge and understanding. And what it means for people is that you as a person, if you're not adding a crazy amount of value, if I'm putting a hamburger on a bun, I mean, that's not adding a crazy amount of value. So I can expect that that's going to need to be replaced. So I have to look for myself, what is something more that I can do? Do I need to get more educated? Do I need to get a certification? What do I need to do to get myself up to the next notch where a computer or robot can't replace me? And I personally don't think I'm replaceable that way, but if I did think I was replaceable by one, then I got to take my game up a notch, and that's what I think it means to people.
So I'm just going to kind of wrap this up by saying all of that noise and drama out there around AI and automation and business transformation being the end of project management is a bunch of nonsense. And here's why. Automation is not the death of project management. It is the opportunity for all of us to finally break free of having to be bogged down by the items that can be automated, the administrative pieces of our job. How much time do you have to spend generating data, generating information, or making little decisions and leaving a gap because you're in the constant, it forces us into box checking mode when we're constantly in administration. By being able to take advantage of technology and AI and automation, we are positioning ourselves to finally move away from that administrative burden that keeps us from being the real impact drivers in the organization. We now can focus on the relationships and leading and all the things we've talked about today. That's where our art is. That's where the people side of change is, where we will thrive. And so project management has shifted, and the advances in technology are just boosting us and giving us this incredible opportunity to fully realize our value to the organization. Because not every decision can be made simply by a machine, but can we have the conversations that the data gave us? Can that data and smaller decisions being automated facilitate the right big conversations that need to happen. And that, my friends, is where your seat at the table comes in, because you're able to facilitate those big decisions, build those relationships, lead people through change, and make a bigger impact. So I say, bring it, baby. We're ready.
Wow. Well, I think I speak on behalf of everybody when I say this was an incredibly dynamic session. We could be talking for hours, and I know we're going to have all three of you come back again to talk about other subjects, because you're a great group to have. You've brought a rich perspective from decades of experience, and I just want to say it was a real pleasure. Everybody, thanks so much. It was a great session.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, Don.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Michael, Susan. Bye.